Hi, Joe McKeaney. Thanks for coming and talking to us. And today you're going to discuss your book, Creating a Successful Relationship. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what the book is.
Okay, so the book is basically covering relationships from the esoteric perspective. So the book is actually broken up into three different sections. The first section is esoteric psychology, because when one studies esoteric psychology, you can see very clearly how it applies to not only people in life and society, but also relationships. And the second part of the book covers all of the minutiae that we find in relationships today, all of the different elements, the hidden elements in relationships, and all of the social interactions between men and women, all of the hidden social interactions that happen before, during, and after relationships. And the third part, in some respects, could be construed as being the most important, because the third part covers a lot of esoteric material, and a lot of esoteric material that is relevant to today's society. So it's basically broken up into three sections.
So it looks at relationships with yourself and with people.
Yes, that's a really important point, because it looks at relationships per se, but it also looks at your relationship to yourself, which is in some respects perhaps more important, because our relationship with ourselves will determine completely 100% how we relate to other people. And so I go into the structure and the psychology of our relationship to ourselves and how that affects our relationship with other people. And there's material given in the volume as to how to work on your own psyche, your own qualities, and your own communication skills. So this is one of the pivotal items of the book itself.
So once someone has read this kind of book, they should be able to deal better with how they deal with relationships, see why they are in certain relationships.
Yes, it's a practical working manual. It's a sort of a step-by-step manual. And I do suggest at the beginning of the book that if people want to, at the beginning, skip the first section on esoteric psychology, it's quite a good idea to do this if they feel that's their thing, and move on to the central core of the book, which is all the minutiae of relationships in the modern day world. And some people will obviously do this, and other people who are really keen to understand the mechanism of how we behave in society, our psychology, our true inner psychology, our esoteric psychology, they will study perhaps the first section, then go into the second section, and perhaps later have a look at the third section, which for me is probably the most important section in the book, the third section.
Why would that be the most important?
Because the third section gives insights into all of the phenomena around us today in society, education, medicine, psychology itself, modern and esoteric psychology, and it gives a greater view of the world than we find in most manuals or books or self-help books on relationships. It's quite in-depth and quite profound in many ways. And I would suggest to people who get hold of the book is that they read this book several times, because the density of materials in this book is quite phenomenal. This book took 3 years to write, and it took a further year to actually put on the market. So there's 4 years in the making. And I think people, when they read this several times, they will get more from the manual. It's like a working manual. Some people skip through to different sections, but I would actually recommend that if they do this, they go back and read it from the very beginning again and study it very carefully from beginning to end and absorb it very deeply, and maybe even go back to it sometime later and study it maybe even a third time, because as I mentioned earlier, the density of materials in this volume is quite unusual. It's quite dense, and its advice, its scope, and its vision, if you like. There's a lot of vision and esoteric materials in this book.
So can you give us a difference between esoteric psychology and just the regular everyday psychology?
Okay, so let's start with regular psychology. For the most part, regular psychology, if we leave out transpersonal psychology, but we just mention the regular psychology that's taught in universities and institutions, then it's really dealing with man as a sick entity. his illnesses, his neurosis, his psychosis, the different maladies that modern people suffer from, and ways of dealing with these maladies, these psychological derangements and emotional derangements and depression and various other things. So for the most part, modern psychology deals with illness in man. It does not deal with man's potentiality, whereas esoteric psychology, Gurdjieff explained, starts where modern psychology ends. And this is a key point with esoteric psychology, because esoteric psychology deals with our potential as human beings, not dealing with us as sick entities, sick human beings, but our potential to develop spiritually to a transcendent level. And all the stages in between ordinary man and this transcendent level are dealt with in esoteric psychology. And of course, alongside this study of esoteric psychology is esoteric alchemy and esoteric cosmology, which are equally important. They should be studied together.
So this is looking at the whole person, as in a holistic way.
It's a holistic approach. And you can start this approach through Ouspensky, because a lot of people in this field recommend that you start through Ouspensky before you study Gurdjieff. And that to some degree makes sense, because when you start with Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, this is a very good primer for then to go further and perhaps read more of Ouspensky's books, and finally you can study Gurdjieff's material, or you can study more of Gurdjieff's students like Kenneth Walker, and there are 5 or 6 different, Maurice Nicole, or 5 or 6 different students that you could approach before you start to read Gurdjieff and All and Everything and various other books by him. But I would suggest probably In Search of the Miraculous is a good primer, a good place to start if you're interested in esoteric psychology.
Because Gurdjieff and Ouspensky were all about starting off looking at yourself, because once you understand yourself, then you can work better with other people.
That's it. I mean, there are certain key things in this, like self-observation. And self-observation is stressed quite a lot in esoteric work, and self-remembering. Of course, self-remembering is on a higher level than self-observation. In self-observation, we begin by simply observing our habits, our body movements, our modes of thought and thinking, our emotional habits, and our negative emotions is probably one of the principal things we have to look at in esoteric psychology, but it's just one element. So we start looking at our negative moods, our negative thoughts, perhaps the negative way we approach certain subjects and certain people, and we delve down into this and see what's behind it. And we can deconstruct much of this negativity just by going in and doing a forensic look at our habits, our reactions to people. So if we do a forensic look at this and we find out clearly what's behind it, and sometimes it's very, very elementary things that are behind these complex habits, we can deconstruct these negative moods, behaviors and habits, and we can neutralize them. And some of the other more complex negative habits, it takes more techniques, higher techniques and more time. But actually I found personally, by doing this forensic autopsy on our habits and our emotional moods and our emotional mindset, we can really deconstruct and neutralize a lot of this. And we can become more balanced people. And this is not taught in standard psychology. You will not find this. Maybe in transpersonal psychology, yes, you'll find some of this. But transpersonal psychology has taken a lot of its material from Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, and very few people know this. So yes, I think esoteric psychology is way ahead of modern psychology. It's much more profound, it's much more useful, and I think it's also very approachable to the person with average intelligence. It's very approachable if you start to study it and to utilize it in your life. It's not like modern psychology that you study it and you memorize it for an exam. You study it and you use it for your life. It's a completely different dynamic, and a very interesting dynamic, because when you study esoteric psychology and you begin to use it in your life, you will notice changes in your character, in your behavior patterns, in your moods. Generally speaking, using this material intelligently, your moods will become more positive. You will become more positive towards other people. You will have a more positive attitude towards life. And you will gain often new inner dynamics that ordinary psychology cannot possibly give you.
So your book is like a guideline to how to implement these kind of theories?
Yes, there is guidance on how to do some of these things, and some of these things are actually very, very important to study and to utilize. But the key thing is to use them in your life. As I said before, not just to study them and memorize them for an exam, because most modern psychology people will study and memorize by rote a lot of this material in modern psychology just to use for an exam. And there are exceptions, because people will study hypnosis in modern psychology as well, and they will use that, which is quite different. It's not really just memorizing and using it in rote fashion. But having studied both, having studied modern psychology and then going on to study esoteric psychology, I found a quantum difference, a huge difference in esoteric psychology. One which is like, it makes one feel very positive about oneself. It gives one new confidence. It gives a new vista on your own potentiality. It gives a new vista on other people and how to deal with other people. And your communication skills will also increase when you practice this esoteric psychology. So it's a number of different dynamics coming together, which for me cannot possibly happen with studying just ordinary psychology.